The question of informed consent goes even further in the baby Faye case because Faye's mom had no medical insurance. This Dr. Bailey offered her a xenograph for free. Her mother had no money for either the alternative procedure or a human heart transplant, which can run $250,000 with drugs to suppress the immune system that could cost in excess of $20,000 a year. So she had no other options. So her poverty and lack of insurance rendered her informed consent meaningless because she was faced with the death of her baby or going through with this procedure. What would anybody choose when you don't have any other options? Even if she knew what the result of the xenograph was, did she understand that this, was a shot in the dark, that it's unlikely to work, that it may just extend her baby's dying? So that's not unusual for this kind of a procedure, particularly when the parents feel like they have no other option or the individuals feel like there's no other options. There's actually a history of this kind of issue with the xenographs. There was in 1963 there was an African American man who was dying of a kidney disease, and he was implanted chimpanzee kidneys. There was another deaf mute man who was dying. He was carried to the hospital unconscious, didn't consent to a similar operation in which he was given a chimpanzee heart. He survived for 2 hours. He didn't give any consent. These are experimental and not therapeutic surgeries, and it's really an exploitation of the individuals, as is pretty much the case in the Baby Faye case. Dr. Bailey did nothing but engage in research versus a therapeutic surgery. The media has also been involved in sensationalizing some of these cases. While the hospitals and the families may try to maintain privacy and confidentiality, the accounts leading up to these big procedures make their way into the media, and they are, there's a lot of conjecture on one side or the other leading up to this, and a lot of misinformation that can sensationalize the whole process. So, with situations like the Bailey case with Baby Faye, there have been claims against Loma Linda Hospital about being inept and other issues. So once the media gets involved, there's a lot of information and misinformation in both directions that can cause additional firestorm of issues that arise. We talked a little bit about therapeutic procedure versus experimental procedures. Clearly, what Dr. Bailey did with Baby Faye was completely experimental. There were alternatives. A therapeutic procedure is one in which the patient has a reasonable chance of a benefit. It offers, if it's unknown or uncertain, or we don't know, have a good idea of what the outcome is going to be, then it's research or experimental. So it's kind of instead of treating people as an end in themselves, the process, you're using the person as a means to an end. So that's an important thing to think about. What was the motive? What was the motivation of the surgeons? Bailey claimed that the procedure had a therapeutic intent, that he wanted to see Baby Faye be able to make it to her 20th birthday. And he worked hard to try to find the right match, but did not explore the opportunities for alternative methods. And knowing that there hadn't been a successful cross species transplant that would likely prolong the dying process. So, whether it was therapeutic or whether it is experimental depends on which side you are on. So that brings us to another issue: is using, the terminology that we choose to use. We call the babies like Faye and Teresa and Gabrielle and all of them. They use terminologies with infant organ donation as giving the gift of life, and we use terms like donation. And it kind of seems inappropriate because they're not able to give their consent to donate their organs. Babies can't be described as giving a gift or providing a gift when they have no option in the process. So it's more, the terminology that's more preferred in these cases are things like organ transfer, organ recovery, organ reassignment. Now it sounds clinical, and it is. They seem cold, but it resists using or implying that the baby in these cases have any option in the situation. So, maybe it should be clinical. Another consideration, and I alluded to this briefly before, is, anencephaly and brain death. And how are we defining what is brain death? And should we change how we're defining brain dead? If we are using the Ontario protocol and we're having to take these babies off from the respirators for a certain amount of time, such that they're not breathing for 3 minutes, multiple times, and then we have to have that claimed by another doctor, which leads to the organ deterioration, then, how maybe we're defining brain dead, and maybe we should define it in a different way or create a new category of brain death in these situations. When this happens, and in fact in Germany, they've actually have changed that terminology, and in Germany they use the term brain absent as slightly different, which allows them to be able to have this additional category that would allow for some organ donations. However, in changing that terminology or defining these babies who are anencephalic as brain dead before they're dead, that leads to the question of whether this is another slippery slope, because are we going to start viewing these babies as non-human? Are we equating them with non-persons? And then is that a slippery slope where we are judging a person's personhood based on their cognitive abilities, whether they're based on their brain function per se? So, again, that's one of the challenges. And then it becomes a bigger issue in if we're applying this to anencephalic babies, is it then going to be applied to others? If a baby has microcephaly, are we going to say that, okay, that's a non-person, or that person is brain dead? So we have things like the Zika virus that's creating these babies with microcephaly. I'm sorry. Is this again another slippery slope where we're going to start stretching that, pushing the boundary a little bit further and a little bit further? So that's an issue. The other part of this argument in the looking at potential to change the legislation regarding the use of anencephalic babies for organ donations, and when do we determine a person is brain dead, is what is the scope of the problem? So in most cases, anencephalic babies are identified in utero, and early enough, it can be identified early enough that the majority of them are aborted. Um, there aren't a lot that are born, maybe 400 a year. And if they're born alive and survive immediately after birth, about half of them will have the potential for donor organs. Many are unacceptable for other reasons, including there can be organ malformation, they can have low birth weight, family may not consent. So, out of that 400 that may be born, half of them may not be able to be donors. And then you have to consider things like tissue matching. Are they able to be a donor for someone who is available or who needs a donor at that particular time? So it comes down to about 30 babies a year that have the potential to be donors. So is it worth changing the legislation based on the potential of 30 donations? But then it's the potential for saving other children. If you're one of the parents of one of those 30 children who may get those organs or benefit from those organs, that brings a whole different light. So, do we weigh the loss of these children with anencephaly versus the loss of the children who need these organs? So again, two sides of an ethical debate. In the Baby Faye case, a lot of people were talking about whether the cost of, and really all of these procedures, talk about the cost of these procedures and weighing the cost against other opportunities. So it was very expensive, as you can imagine, for the Baby Faye surgery. And although the parents didn't pay anything, they estimated at the time the cost was about $500,000. And could that $500,000 have been better spent maybe doing 1,000 other types of surgeries that could have been helpful to other people? Maybe, babies that had other issues, prenatal deformities or something that the parents also couldn't afford surgeries. And yet all of this huge chunk of money went to this experimental surgery that Baby Faye ended up dying 21 days later. You look at the Baby Gabrielle and Baby Hulk. The surgery alone was about $140,000, in addition to the costs of the flights and all of the other the technology in keeping Baby Gabrielle alive for a week. Is it worth it? How do we place a value on the life of Paul Hulk, who now has his own family, versus the expense? So, that's one of the issues that has to be considered. And then the other issue is, in performing these surgeries and these experimental things, are the physicians, are we lifting them up for the right reasons, or are they in this more for the notoriety? There's an old saying that goes, beware the surgeon with one case, and that really kind of summarizes the ethics of what we've been talking about. We're doing all of these experimental things, and what is the purpose of it? Is it truly to do what's best for the person, or is it to gain notoriety for the institution or for the physician? And that's one of the things that really has to be looked at.